My name is Frank Thompson. I'm a retired correctional professional who was superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary when the only two executions to have taken place in Oregon over 32 years took place. It was my responsibility, with a wonderful and dedicated and committed cadre of staff, to conduct this daunting task. By the end of my presentation, I'm hoping to share with you how I went from supporting the death penalty to becoming an abolitionist. I'm also wanting to leave with those within the sound of my voice an impression about what administering the death penalty, killing another human being in the name of the public, can do to the people that are called upon to perform these tasks. Now, in order for me to get you there, I'd like to give you a little context of how I began supporting the death penalty. I'm a product of the civil rights era, back in the 60s more particularly. This was during a time when a number of people, both black and white, were being killed in pursuit of their constitutional rights. Emmett Till is a nationally known incident where a young man was murdered because he was insulting to a white woman. There were black and white men and women who were snatched off of freedom riding buses and they were killed. 4 girls in Birmingham, Alabama were killed from the bombing of a church. And everybody in my community, from a very emotional standpoint, felt that the people that would do these kinds of things deserved death. The capital punishment was an appropriate social sanction for those who would commit those kinds of crimes. I was young enough to understand that the death penalty and the way it was administered was not a perfect process, but so were other institutions in our society that were imperfect, and over time, hopefully they would be improved upon and become fairer and more just. But nevertheless, I moved into years of becoming a military policeman in the service, a law enforcement officer in the state of Arkansas, and a warden, where the death penalty was still a part of justice, somewhere on the continuum of the administration of justice. It still continued to have its place in my mind as being appropriate under certain circumstances. While serving as a warden in Arkansas, I did not have the personal experience of administering the death penalty, but I was running an institution in the system where an execution that was taking place in another institution of an inmate by the name of Ricky Ray Rector. This occurred in about 1992. Ricky Ray Rector had blown the frontal lobe of his brain out in an attempt to avoid apprehension after having killed someone. He was later sentenced to death. And there was quite a public debate, outcry, as to whether or not a person as challenged, mentally challenged as Ricky was, should be executed. Nevertheless, his execution date was set, and Bill Clinton came off of the campaign trail to Arkansas to let it be known that of his position on this particular execution. During the execution, Ricky Ray Rector underwent one of the most gruesome, botched executions that I had heard of up to that time. They had trouble finding the vein. Those that wrote about it and heard that were there described the scene as being one where you could hear him screaming in pain, registering the discomfort he was undergoing. Now, just prior to his execution, to give you an idea of how mentally challenged he was having his last meal. And before they escorted him to the gurney, he gave his dessert to one of the correctional officers and said, "When they finish with me, I'll come back and get it." His execution was so horrendous that a chaplain by the name of Dennis Pigman resigned following it. That stuck in my mind. I had not really contemplated and wrestled with the issue of torturing a person with lethal injection. Lethal injection was supposed to have been the most humane way to conduct an execution. So it at least made me sort of go, But it wasn't to the extent that I abandoned the notion of the administration of the death penalty. Shortly after that, in about 1994, I was recruited to come to Oregon as superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary. I was recruited here in order to put inmates to work. The state of Oregon had put in its constitution Measure 17, which required all inmates working as much as the average citizen in the community. And I realized that Oregon hadn't had executions for quite some time. And quite frankly, I knew I might have to do one or two or whatever, but I hoped it would be another 32 years and I'd be retired from corrections by that time. Upon interviewing me, they asked me straightforward whether or not I could do an execution if it became my responsibility. Without hesitation, I told them I could. Taking the life of another human being wasn't a foreign notion to me as a soldier, military, policeman. During the Vietnam era, I did a tour in Korea, being trained as a police officer. I was trained to take life under very narrow and specific circumstances. So with that kind of background and experience, I told them I could do my job. I'm a good soldier, having no idea that within 18 months, within 16 months, I was going to be presented with a death warrant to conduct the first execution in 32 years. Well, up to that very point, I did not know that Oregon had not rewritten its death penalty protocols to death by lethal injections, which had become legal, from death by gas, which had been outlawed and which had been done away with. The protocols were still death by gas. So what did that mean for Frank Thompson and his dedicated staff? We had to pull together all newbies. No one had been through an execution before. We had to rewrite the protocols for the execution process. We had to pull together the team of people who were going to carry this out. We had to go to other institutions, San Quentin, Idaho, look at the execution protocols and witness other people in being executed so that we could have some depth of experience in putting together our own execution process. Now, if I had come to Oregon and the staff here had done an execution or two within the past few years, and they were accustomed to doing an execution here and there, I just would have pulled my team together and pulled the protocol books out and said, okay, give me an idea how it's done. We've got another one to do. Let's get it done. I probably could have done 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But no, we were doing this for the very first time in 32 years, And I cannot in words express to you the kind of pressure it put on all of them. And I think it's important for me to share with you that when I tell the story, I don't want you to think that it's me or I. In some way, every person that had a role to play in pulling this together were going through their own trauma, were going through their own doubts, regardless of whether or not they supported the death penalty. There were these pressures of taking life, of doing it for the first time under the scrutiny of the press. Tremendous, tremendous pressure. I had to confidentially identify who the executioner was going to be. I called a professional in from another state to take me into a little room and show me how to depress the plunger into the syringe so that the lethal chemicals would fall out or come out at the rate equal to the pull of gravity. You didn't want to project it or propel it. I was trained first. Then I had to find an executioner confidential to the rest of the world and train that person how to administer the lethal injection. There are so many different stories in this process that all of us went through that sometimes when I'm telling it, a different scenario steps out as being significant and beginning to make me reach down inside to come to grips with where I really stood about the death penalty. And at some point, it's not like I call my staff in and say, you know, I can't do this anymore. It wasn't like that. I can recall maybe in a moment of candor, and we were tight, where we would be honest with one another. In a moment of candor, I just shared with them, look, if any of you, or either one of you, if you don't want to follow through with this, just as this is voluntary, I can understand. But we're going to get this done. We've got a contract with the state. Not a single one of my staff backed out. There were some who supported it. There were others not so much. But it was then I began to realize that here I was, training a decent group of men and women on how to take the life of another human being in the name of a public policy that could not be shown to work. They were dependent upon me to get them through this. And that is a heavy burden that the state of Oregon puts on its staff. There was a study conducted by Portland State University, I think in 2004, where it determined that fully 1/3 of correctional staff manifest some degree of stress, post-traumatic stress, having nothing to do with executions, just because they work in corrections. Now, can you imagine going into that population of staff and then pulling out a team to go and execute someone? Capital punishment requires us to create another group of victims when we don't have to do that. I'm so glad to notice that as a country, we are very slow to put our soldiers, boots on the ground, in an area where the risks that they take are not likely to produce a desired outcome. We are very slow to put them into those kinds of situations. I'm warning ourselves as a community to begin looking at correctional officers as we do our soldiers. Correctional officers are not trained to kill. They're trained to keep the peace. They're trained to keep people segregated and isolated from society. They're trained to support rehabilitation programs, get inmates off of drugs, get them educated, get their GEDs, and hopefully get some kind of training that they can use and become productive citizens when they've served. That's what correctional officers are supposed to do. And if we step back and take a real look at the big picture and think about what capital punishment is supposed to do, it's supposed to kill those who have, with deliberation, premeditation, and a number of other criteria, but those two at least, taken the life of a human being. Now just think about this. By the time a correctional staff person walks into this room and effectively takes the life of a convicted felon, each staff person will have gone through more deliberation and more premeditation in taking the life of another human being than any inmate on death row in any prison in the country. Now, why would we as a moral society want to willingly put our men and women in a situation like that when the outcomes are so debatable as to whether or not it benefits society as a whole? I look at capital punishment as being a public policy. All public policies should have as their ultimate design outcomes that benefits and improves the welfare of the community as a whole. Capital punishment does not do that. And when you realize that we have life without the possibility of parole, it makes absolutely no sense to put correctional officers in this kind of position. That is what I'd like to leave with the people in the state of Oregon, and that's what I'd like to leave with our legislators, that there is absolutely no way that you can continue to support the death penalty without putting your own staff. Many of those that support the death penalty have sisters, brothers, wives, relatives who are correctional professionals. And if you ask the average correctional professional whether we need the death penalty in order to run safe institutions, the answer is no. And even among those correctional officers who support the death penalty, the death penalty would be low on the list of things that correctional professionals need in order to run safe and the kinds of institutions that will help to make inmates productive citizens when they get out. That's what I'd like to leave with those that are listening to my presentation. Thank you.